Hi, everybody. Once again, this is Jake with Politics by Jake, and this is the usual show that we have. This is the Monday morning show, by the way. This is Monday morning at June 24th at 7 a.m., and I'm glad that you're here listening to me. It's a brand new week, and it's going to be, honestly, there's just so many things going on as I was sitting here contemplating what it was that I was going to talk about. There's just so much. And the purpose of our show, of course, is to have a kind of a semi-weekly, that's twice weekly. We do our show on Mondays and we do it once again on Fridays, a twice weekly show to talk about various topics that are going on in the world, in the United States. And of course, one of the most important is the defeat of Trump, the defeat of MAGA fascism. And we also provide things that you can do in your individual and in your several circumstances to help bring this about. So among the many things that we could talk about, we're going to be talking about Ukraine and MAGA fascism and the danger that is. And we'll have a segment later on about the concept of posse comitatus. Those of you who used to watch the old Western shows and even the newer ones, when they're chasing the thief, the sheriff gets together a posse. Well, that's based on the idea of getting civilians under authority in order to get something accomplished. And that's basically the Posse Comitatus Act. And we're going to talk to that. And we're going to talk about that with reference to Project 2025. Project 2025 is the MAGA fascism program that they're announcing basically to the public. And, this is one of the disconcerting things from a certain standpoint, because with the MAGA fascists, you can kind of say to them, what color is the sky in your world? Because what they propose is so outlandish, it's so outrageous, it's so patently fascist and oppressive and authoritarian that you wonder why it is that they would do this, why they would be so bold. But the idea is, you have Steve Bannon, for example, just for one, who I could talk for a long time on this, saying, we want your fear and we want you to be afraid of us. This is, extraordinary. And I think this is one of the reasons why Trump and the MAGA fascists are going to lose the election, because they come out and they say things like this, because of the thing that I just said, what color is the sky in your world? They just really see things from a different point of view, and there's no dealing with it. It's just completely different. And the second thing is that they think they're going to win. And once you have a situation where you think that nobody can stop you, you become bolder in putting forth your plan. So that's what they're doing. And we have talked about Project 2025 on this show. We'll be talking about it a little more in this segment. And finally, we have an interesting segment that we're going to be talking about, which is how it's the second British invasion, and it's not the Beatles. I'm taking away my prefatory remarks from the segment, that it's not the Beatles, but it's Fleet Street British tabloid journalism attacking or taking over the United States. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. I actually couldn't get in the segment everything I wanted to talk about, but I'll give you a start on it. So that's basically it. And we'd like to remind everybody before we begin that for those of you who are fans of the show and who like it, and you don't always get to see it, I also have videos and on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/ @ Politics by Jake. And I have many videos there that you can go to see that talk about some of these same things and at greater length. And of course, you get to see my sunny face. And I'm on Facebook right now, where my page is, unfortunately, is just Lawrence Jacobson. I have several pages on Facebook, and I guess they tried to keep the pages down to a minimum. So I think I've done all my pages. So we'll be working on that. On Twitter X, my handle is JakeLaw08. That's JAKELAW08. You can see my political comments too. And sometimes I also talk about baseball and hockey too. Incredible Stanley Cup going on right now, but mostly political commentary. And with that, let's get started. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake, and I'm back again to talk to all of you who are business owners. You want asset protection, right? And why? Because you wanted the wealth that you were growing in the business to be protected in the best way possible, and you wanted to keep your personal wealth out of it. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? If you're like me, that makes you feel pretty angry. Do you want to know if there's any way to protect your business and your personal wealth? Well, go to www.jakelaw.me or call me directly now at 573-454-1168, and let's talk about that. Call now. Save your assets now. And now we're back. And this is Politics by Jake. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine with regard to my statement, and you've heard me make this before, that this is the beginning of World War III, and my justification for this partly be because of the vast differential in manpower that Russia has as opposed to what Ukraine has. This is one point. There are several points to this, but this is one I want to talk about. This is an interesting statement here I just came across that I'd like to share with you. It's from a week ago. It's from the Toronto Star in the June 8th edition of 2024. The article is entitled, open quote, "This country," or I should say, quote, "This country just crossed a self-imposed red line in Russia's war on Ukraine," close quote. That's kind of a long title. And how it could change the conflict. And the pertinent statement about it is this, and I'm quoting here again, quote, "France is the first country to send its military personnel into Ukraine, but French President Emmanuel Macron says that a coalition is being formed of like-minded countries willing to step across a self-imposed red line to get to work in the war zone," and it closed the quote. It goes on to say, so far Poland and the Balkan states, and I'm kind of quoting in and out here, which are much closer to the fighting, have expressed a willingness to follow France's lead. Canada has at least left the door open after signing a 10-year security agreement during Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's visit to Kiev in February. So there you have that, and that's the issue. There is a depletion of Ukrainian manpower. Inevitably, that's going to occur, and that needs to be supplemented. And this is the first step in that the military planners are looking forward and viewing the situation where the Russians have allowed over 500,000, well over 500,000 at the time of this segment that we're talking about here, its soldiers to become casualties on the battlefield. Enormous destruction of material of war. Enormous. And they know that Putin absolutely positively will not stop unless he is compelled to stop by dint of overwhelming force, and maybe not even then. And this is an aspect of fascism, and I could talk about, I guess I will. I'll talk about for a moment what Lucius Clay, who was general and commandant of Berlin in 1961 during the Kennedy administration, said to Kennedy about this. And he said that all the Russians really respond to is force. If they think that you're weak, if they think that you're soft, they're going to attack like a predator, like a bear. Russia is often described as a bear. It's going to attack like a bear and it's going to go after you. And this is an aspect of fascism. And fascism always does this. I mean, Italy, Germany, Japan, all of these dictators, North Korea, they all say that the West is weak. They always do this. They always say that the West is weak. So this is like an aspect of fascism. I think it's kind of the aspect of a deluded mind, but not kind of segueing on this, but taking this, the natural extension of this, I'm reminded, as we look at the desperateness and the viciousness and the unyieldingness of the fascist right movement in this country, they always double down. For example, they're completely unrepentant, unashamed, unabashed. There's nothing you can do to shame them. For example, I know that you all know, and I don't have to report to you because you already know it from a multitude of sources, that Donald Trump was convicted on 34 counts of the indictment, which was, all of the counts, and he is now a convicted felon. And we can now call him that, and I will do so at every opportunity. Convicted felon Donald Trump. But not 36 hours after the conviction, well, let me maybe not, maybe it was 36, maybe it took them a little longer, because it set them back on their heels. I don't think that they were expecting this, but just a very short time after that, the fascist right and their moles and there's a certain phrase for it, for excrement posters, poo-poo posters, duty posters, and there's actually a more expressive term about it, but I don't think I'm going to use it, because even though this is a podcast, it's being broadcast on channels that are controlled by the Federal Communications Commission. So let's go with poo-poo. Let's go with duty. Let's go with excrement posters. The technicians who are among them, not only inside the federal agencies, but also literally inside both houses of Congress, have now sought to call it a fake conviction. And this is, again, one of the big lies of Hitler. Those of you who listen to me regularly know this is one of the things I talk about, the concept of the big lie, as Hitler famously said to Joseph Goebbels, his minister of propaganda. And I've said it time and time again, and I'm going to say it again now. Lies, he said, lies. Tell them lies. The bigger, the better. Sooner or later, something is bound to stick. And so they are, after having skipped a beat, the expression is that, and they didn't skip a beat. They skipped a beat on this one. But now they're proposing that this is, a fake conviction, and that it is a politically motivated conviction, and that it is solely a politically motivated conviction, and that convicted felon Donald Trump was not actually guilty of anything. And this appeals, of course, to the fascists, to the maggots, who think that Trump is the second coming of Jesus Christ. And I am not engaging in overstatement when I say this. This is what makes MAGA fascism a cult, because there are elements of worship of the leader in them. That's what a cult is. And so they are saying that it was a fake conviction. And recently they have trotted out an alleged letter from the court with regard to a juror who supposedly talked to one of his or her relatives and said that Trump was going to be convicted. And much is being made of this, and they are attacking in every single way that they can. And by the way, they've been doing this all along, the integrity of the court and the basic integrity of the judicial process, because they have nothing else. And they cannot allow this slur of 34 felony convictions to go unaddressed, because it has already impacted the polls as far as support, and it's going to continue, by the way. He's already lost a significant amount of support, and as it continues, for example, he is sentenced. That's going to happen in July. That may be delayed or postponed, but it's going to happen before the election in the event. He won't be able to delay or postpone it that long. They will lose yet more, so they have to do something, and this is what they're doing. So we will see how that shakes out, but it is an indication of their desperateness because of the conviction. 34 counts, that constitutes a crushing defeat for MAGA fascism and for Donald Trump's hopes to get into power in November. Once again, actually, he will get into power in January, but, presumptively, if everything goes the way he wants it to go, he'll be elected in November, and he will implement Project 2025, about which we have talked and will talk further, make himself a dictator, because that's part of Project 2025, impose the idea of a unified Reich. That's Hitlerian again, and that's a part of 2025. And this will be, Hitler was the Fourth Reich, Nazi Germany. This will be the United States, the Fourth Reich. Or I'm sorry, the Third Reich was Nazi Germany. And this will be the Fourth Reich. And what will all this do? Well, it's easy. It'll keep him out of jail. It will make him a dictator for life. It will allow him to continue the grift. Don't forget, he's a grifter. He's a con man. He wants to grift the suckers and the rubes. The fact challenged, the logic challenged, the reason challenged, those who are in thrall to him. This is his plan. And he has a willing coterie and train, if you will allow me to use a word, of technical supporters like the ideologue Bannon, for example, who is going to have to report to jail pretty soon to begin his sentence, and Stephen Miller, whose rise to fascism probably stems from the fact, if we're going to be truthful about this, that once he asked a Latino girl out to the prom when he was 16 or 17 years old, and she refused him, to all of the other supporters who are technicians. And this is part of the secret combination. And, a lot of people, they don't like to talk about this. I can understand it from a certain standpoint, But here at Politics by Jake, we make a distinction between conspiracies, for example, crackpot conspiracy theories, which we tend to deplore the idea of and look down upon. And we talk about it as a good example, the idea of Pizzagate, where supposedly a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor had a pedophile ring that was being run and supported and funded by Hillary Clinton, and for which the pizza parlor was merely a front. And this conspiracy theory first came out something like 2010 or something like that. And since then, it has had various iterations and reiterations. And there's no truth to any of it. And for this reason, this is why we deplore such theories. But the idea of secret combinations, the idea, for example, that business, political, and government and religious leaders could band together for common cause out of sight and out of knowledge of the sovereign people of the United States, that's absolutely positively the case. I mean, that is no great stretch of the imagination once you think about it. We have, for example, of Eisenhower, who in his farewell speech in the draft before the final draft, which was the one that he gave to the people, the one that was actually heard by the people, he talked about the military-industrial complex. But in the last draft before the final, the word congressional was removed because Eisenhower intended to tell the people not about the military-industrial complex, but about the military-industrial congressional complex. But as I say, this was removed. So we basically have Eisenhower supporting this view. So this is not far-fetched at all. Not at all. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and have you ever tried to get a business credit line? If you did, what's one of the unpleasant things that you found out? You found out that the only way that you can get business credit is if you personally guarantee each and every single loan, each and every single commercial credit line. Now, let me ask you this question. How did that make you feel? If you're like me, I would feel like they were giving with one hand and taking away with the other. If this bothers you, I encourage you to go to my website, www.jakelaw.me, where I talk about this and several other important products and services that can benefit really almost all people listening to the sound of my voice. Call me at 573-454-1168 so we can talk about this, get mad about it together, and see if there isn't some sort of solution. That's www.jakelaw.me. That's JAKELAW.me, M-E. That's www.jakelaw.me, and the phone number is 573-454-1168. And now let's get back to Politics by Jake. He's talking about some very interesting things here, and you'll want to stay tuned. So without further ado, back to Jake. And this is Politics by Jake. And now, since I'm kind of free-forming, let's talk a little bit about Project 2025 and the idea of the military being used in this country. And when I say that, I mean on American soil. And with that regard, we have this is in the Washington Post, and this is by Beth Reinhardt. And this is also on June 8th at 6 a.m. She posted this. And it's entitled, Trump Loyalist Pushes Post-Constitutional Vision for Second Term. And this is about, the byline says, Russ Vought, the former president's budget director, is laying the groundwork for a broad expansion of presidential power. And this is what I keep telling you, that you really need to understand, that these people are ideologues, they're technicians, they are fanatics, they don't quit. And this is the essence. Well, I mean, this is part of the secret combination that is MAGA fascism. And these guys don't quit. If you beat them, they just come back. And that's basically what this article about. And it says a battle-tested DC, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just going to set it up because I'm going somewhere with this. A battle-tested D.C. bureaucrat and self-described Christian nationalist is drawing up detailed plans for a sweeping expansion of presidential power in a second Trump administration. Russ Vought, who served as the former president's budget chief, calls his political strategy for raising long-standing guardrails radical constitutionalism. He has helped craft proposals for Donald Trump to deploy the military to quash civil unrest, seize more control over the Justice Department, and assert the power to withhold congressional appropriations. And this is just on Trump's first day back in office. And I'll stop right there because I don't have to go any further with this. I basically set up the premise. Now, once again, let's talk about this. The idea of the military being used on American soil. This is actually a violation of something called the Posse Comitatus Act. And the Posse Comitatus Act is kind of an interesting law because where it stems from is 1878. It was after Reconstruction, and it ostensibly, and in this way, it prescribes, it's good in this way. It prescribes, which means to prevent or prohibit. Interestingly, all three words there begin with P. Military interference in civilian affairs. And the premise is, once again, on the surface, this is a good premise, but the fascist right will always weaponize these things. So a lot that was meant to proscribe threats to both democracy and personal liberty also has its origins in the rise of white supremacy. Because when you had the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Grant was their worst enemy. He all but destroyed the white supremacist elements of the South, and that includes the Klan. But in 1878, the white supremacists, the industrialists, who decided that this was eating into their profits, who were aided by the Northern Copperhead, who were, like I said, they were Northerners who basically supported Southern views. Also, the ever-present oligarchs and money power, which was there, wanted this reinstituted. And, of course, the withdrawal of American troops, which had been, down there during Reconstruction, to ensure that the new laws were being enforced because of the rampant unconstitutionality, because of the foolish customs and mores and traditions of the planter class of the South, which, of course, supported slavery and which, according to Alexander Campbell, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, was actually the sole reason for the initiation of the rebellion of the South against the North, which the South likes to call the War of Northern Aggression, but it was not. It was the Civil War. It was the War of Southern Aggression against the North. It was a rebellion. And for that, you want to go to the internet and look up the Cornerstone speech and just enter that. And if you want to be more specific, but you'll find it if you do that, enter the name Alexander Campbell, and it clearly states there in unequivocal language, there's no disputing it, that the reason why the South rebelled and started the Civil War was because of the persistence of these now unconstitutional mores and practices and foolish customs, foolish traditions that existed and exist among the people. And I'll talk about this to a greater extent. And it was because of slavery. It was because of slavery. That was the cornerstone of their enterprise. That's why it's commonly called the Cornerstone speech. Something that's not often talked about. We tend to look at things going on in the present, We don't understand how they enacted in the past, but we will talk about it. It's on my mind as we come up to Independence Day. Coming up here as we come talking about Gettysburg, which is also coming. I will try my best to put in a segment about this so you can understand this. And by the way, I have several videos on this. If you want to learn more about it before hearing the podcast, go to youtube.com/@politics by Jake. And I have videos there where I talk about all that at greater length. But getting back to the Posse Comitatus, this is Latin. And it refers to a group of people who are mobilized by the sheriff. And once again, this is of old vintage. This goes back to the common law in England. And the common law, of course, has been adopted by the United States. This is sometimes referred to as British and American law or Britanno-American law. But anyway, a working definition of Posse Comitatus, without translating the Latin, it's a group of people who are mobilized by a sheriff or a constable or some similar authority to suppress lawlessness in the country. That's a posse. That's Posse Comitatus, or for short, it's called posse. And the idea is that it's okay for civilians in certain limited instances to do that, but it's not okay to use the American military to do that. And what Trump wants to do in more ways than one, and this is where it gets back to the Washington Post article and Russ Vought, is part of Project 2025, which we've already talked about on our show, undoubtedly will again on the uptick to the election, and especially if Trump gets in, God help us all, we will be talking about it because it will be imminently imposed upon this country. And one of the things that he wants to do is he wants to use the American military to round up immigrants. And you know what this means, don't you? It means basically it's an excuse. It's basically to round up anybody that he doesn't like the looks of, which is one of the reasons we've talked here on the show several times before about the Muslim constituency, of which people like Jayapal and Ilhan Omar and other members of the anecdotally called squad talk about how there should not be a vote for Biden. And this is more of this ultra-left nonsense. Because I ask you, if Biden does not keep the presidency, who are some of the first people that Trump will use the American military to round up and deport? It will be the Muslim community, and there will be havoc among them. So this is the sophomoric, and, honestly, this doesn't even rise to the level of sophomoric. These are more like freshman antics of members of the squad who willingly talk about things like this, are deceiving as their own constituency. As I described earlier in the show, their base, they're either blind to their old ulterior motives. I talked about how Jayapal's daughter got into Colombia and how not even anybody, even if you're qualified, can, not necessarily get into Colombia. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of worthy applicants and they don't get in. Or they are cynical and they are doing this on purpose. It's either that. Either they're blind to their own ulterior motives and their own prestige and their own privilege, or they're doing it on purpose. I'm not sure which is worse. Probably on purpose is worse. But if Trump is installed in the presidency, this is one of the planks of Project 2025, and the American military will be used. And Trump has already, or should I say his backers, because Trump is not smart enough, he's just a totem. He's really just a convenient figurehead for the fascist forces in the United States that are working to help him get elected again. And not only that, but for the international forces that want to see him get elected again. And that is to use the American military to round up immigrants, to deport them, and basically as an excuse, as I said, to round up anybody else that you don't like. Or I should say that the MAGA fascist cult doesn't like. And I assure you that Muslims are either at the top of the list or they are near the top of the list. And if it doesn't work, his intention is to federalize the police. So if posse comitatus prevents him from using the American military, he will use the police and he will federalize them all. And he will take away all responsibility and immunize them against the abuses which we have so often see them impose upon the populace in the name of law and order. And there are so many examples of this that it would not be enough time in the show to talk about all the examples. So I will just stop this segment there for now and say, this is Politics by Jake. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back. And what I want to talk to you about now is something I call virtual invisibility. No, not literal comic book type invisibility. What I am talking about is a practical invisibility, a kind of invisibility where you cannot be seen, where your personal transactions are shielded, where your business affairs are hidden from prying eyes, where a purchase of certain items is far less likely to be able to be found out by persons who have an intent to do you and your loved ones harm, the kind that results in the preservation and the protection of your personal assets, your business assets, all for your benefit and the benefit of your loved ones, the ones you are doing all this for in the first place. That's virtual invisibility. Crazy, you say? No, this exists. It's a thing. Want to know more? Contact me either at my website, www.jakelaw.me, or call me direct at 573-454-1168. Do it now. Become invisible now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake. Now, here's another interesting thing. It's about how our media is run by the English. I want to talk about that a little bit. There's a new British invasion, and I'm not talking about the Beatles And I'm not talking about the Rolling Stones. I'm talking about a group of reactionary British operatives who are taking over, and in effect have taken over, the commanding heights of the U.S. media scene. And that would be the New York Times. Well, I mean, the New York Times is what it was. But the Washington Post, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and other places. Now, the idea is that cynical British operatives, people, I guess, with very little stake in the United States, you might call them cosmopolitans, perhaps infected by the frequent British problem of envy and resentment against the United States. You know, the old saying in World War II, when people were asked about the Americans, they said they're overfed, they're oversexed, and they're over here. So, you know, maybe something like that. And envy and resentment also for them having usurped the rightful place of their empire as the top nation, as they would say. But this level of silliness is silly, is getting away from just talk, and it's been transmuted into something perhaps more sinister. Even now, I'm for an alliance with Great Britain. Even during World War II, it was possible to have strategic differences. Certainly there were those between Eisenhower and Montgomery, or between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, and for the alliance to still press onwards. And you know, there were differences, and there were a certain amount of bad blood and epithets that went back and forth. And what we're doing here is we're operating at a level of whatever differences there might be, they do not challenge the fundaments of the Anglo-American alliance. And I'm for preserving that. But it's good, and I'm kind of prefacing something that I'm going to talk about here. I won't mention his name yet, but I will in a minute. It's good to have one's eyes open. In other words, just because you're for it doesn't mean that you have to sit still for every unprincipled adventure or hint, and I won't say his name yet, who gets off the boat these days with the intention of taking over one of the commanding heights of U.S. journalism. Now, let's just start with a little prehistory, shall we, of the used-to-be tradition of American reporters as being these hard-bitten, very realistic, and sometimes eloquent purveyors of news. So let's go back to the days of William Shirer, the CBS war correspondent. Shirer was, of course, there in the 30s in Germany during the rise of Hitler, and he wrote this wonderful book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I've read it. Now, of course, whether it was unified or not, we'd have to ask the MAGA campaign. You perhaps have heard that Trump wants a unified Reich. And by the way, the deal on this, in case you haven't heard, is this. A couple of weeks ago now, sometime in the middle of May, Trump causes to be posted, and this is stochastic, by the way. And let's review that just briefly. This is what he does so he can have what used to be called in the days of St. Ronnie the actor, quote, plausible deniability, close quote. So in other words, the way this works, if he's tasked with it, he can say, oh, you know, I didn't say that about a unified Reich. But as you recall, the definition of stochastic terrorism, a really good working definition, would be the phenomenon that occurs when speakers, you know, like Trump or like Biden for that matter, or RFK Jr., or anybody who has large audiences, engages in frequent rhetorical attacks against political opposition, eventually inciting an ideologically aligned individual who is not that person, but who is ideologically aligned with the person the speaker is talking to, will take, as a consequence of that, unpredictable and often violent action. And stochastic terrorism is an expedient form of dealing with political opponents because, due to First Amendment incitement jurisprudence, which is, in other words, a speaker inciting to violence or some similar thing, speakers who say insightful things, and I don't mean, boy, that's really insightful, that's really interesting. I'm talking about inciting, I-N-C-I-T-I-N-G, inciting. Things remain legally insulated from accountability for the cause, for the result as a consequence of this, and that's why they do it, because they can do it. And the pertinent case that basically says they can do it is Brandenburg v. Ohio. which is a 1969 Supreme Court case. And basically, like I said, it insulates a speaker from referencing things that are said by others, but which he posts, in this case on social media, to his own social media account or his webpage or, whatever, which gives the distinct impression that he believes the things he is posting. And yet, according to the incitement test in Brandenburg, and as is often the case in court cases like this, in my opinion, there will be a test that the court will create. And this is designed for future cases down the road. So if it happens again, you can reference this case, in this situation, the Brandenburg case, and you can see if the alleged violation falls within the parameters of the prescribed test. It's actually a pretty good way to do stuff. So that's what they did in Brandenburg, and it's called the incitement test. So according to that test, such a speaker has not said them with his own mouth and is therefore, as I said, legally insulated from accountability for any negative results that accrue as a consequence of this kind of speech, this stochastic kind of speech. And I would say that you would have to say that a posting of social media from somebody talking about the need for a Fourth Reich, a unified Reich, and you will remember, by the way, that the Nazi fascist government in the 20th century was called the Third Reich. So in other words, that's, pretty ominous, calling for a Fourth Reich or a unified Reich. That would pretty much fall right back into the category of the stochastic comment. So, okay, getting back what I was talking about, we were talking about journalists in 20th century American journalism, and this is really kind of, by way of preface to the point, which is how, for those of you who are just joining us, the British are, kind of taking over the major American media sources. I mentioned Shire. Another American journalist you had was Edward R. Murrow of CBS. He was in London during the Blitzkrieg, which is in the late 30s, so a little later than Shire. And this is a guy who, would give these rousing descriptions, these first-person accounts, which were very, very important to engage in pro-British sentiment in the war. In other words, when the Germans were bombing London, he would literally be on a rooftop nearby, and you could hear the sound of the bombs dropping. If you go on the internet and you listen to the broadcast, it's probably on YouTube somewhere, you can hear the bombs dropping. And he would do this segment literally during the bombing. And this was, a very compelling backdrop, as you can imagine. He would start, and there would be the bombs dropping and the explosions, and he would say, "This is London." And he would start off that way. It was really quite something. This was so compelling that he's considered to be the father of CBS News, and with it pretty much network news broadcasting of the 50s and into the 60s. And a lot of the people, Charles Collingworth is one. And I realize that some of you who are younger may not know these names, but these are kind of big names in radio and TV broadcasting. These were people who had been working for Murrow to begin with. Sometimes they were referred to as Murrow's boys. Another one is John Gunther. He was the guy who wrote these inside books like Inside Germany, and this is more like in the 40s. Inside the USA, that's another one. Sometimes the seamy side of life, of course, but highly interesting, widely read. And how about Lowell Thomas, another CBS journalist who is going all over the world looking for stories. In fact, if you watch the really excellent movie, which I totally recommend for everybody should go see it. It's a classic movie. It's called Lawrence of Arabia. Thomas is actually in the movie, or an actor portraying Thomas. He's depicted there in a certain part of the movie. And when you get to it, Thomas is the American correspondent with his primitive typewriter, the kind in the box he carries with him, who coins the phrase Lawrence of Arabia. And his name was actually, not Lawrence of Arabia, it was T.E. Lawrence. And he was a British, I think he ended up as a colonel in World War I. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back again to talk to you about one of these little wrinkles that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of happiness for people who actually want to own a business or who have just started a business or who have been operating a business now for some time. It doesn't really matter. My guess is that you wanted asset protection. That's one of the reasons for starting a business. You wanted to grow wealth and you wanted to protect the wealth that you created, and you thought that a limited liability company or a corporation would be the way to do that. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? Do you want to know if there's any way to fix that? Go to www.jakelaw.me, that's JAKELAW.me, and watch my video where I talk about this very important thing, and then set up a time where we can have a phone conference or call me directly now at 573-454-1168. That's 573-454-1168. Call now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. We're not going to start quibbling about positions, exactly what the right thing to do about it, but the idea is that there were these people. There was Sharer, there was Murrow, there was Collingsworth, there was Thomas, there was Gunther, etc., who were representative of something in the American journalistic tradition, which is different from the British, and this has been lost, and this is part of my point in talking about this. You could see this over the years as there are more and more British voices, more and more British correspondents, and some are very good, but on the other hand, here's the fundamental problem. The British correspondents naturally, unavoidably, because of their societal and cultural upbringing, they're going to tend to be monarchists, and because they have a queen, and now they have a king. And as such, they are usually going to naturally be devoted to what I guess you could call a hierarchically stratified society. Quite often, the British correspondent is going to be, I think, less sensitive to the wretched of the earth. In other words, some of these correspondents I just named, they would go someplace around the world and they'd see the population there is oppressed. You would see that they're impoverished. They're troubled. They're beaten down by usually oligarchy, right? Because that's the worst in terms of oppression. Like if you've got one tyrant, that's bad enough. But if you've got 100 tyrants who are oligarchs, that's perhaps even worse. So the idea there is this oppression of the people of the earth. This was a characteristic American point of view. It was more interested in equality, democracy, fairness, things like this. And what I am proposing here is that this idea has been lost. And it has been lost in consequence of these British that have come over and have taken over a lot of the American media outlets. So what do we have now? Well, this is the name that I was withholding from you at the beginning when I was talking. Much of the damage, of course, has been done by Rupert Murdoch. He's from Australia. He spent most of his time in Britain, though. He's now an American citizen, thanks to St. Ronnie the actor. That was a very ill-considered move. That happened in the mid-'80s. He paved the way so he could become an American citizen, and that allowed him to purchase more and more properties in the same town. And now, as a result, Murdoch and his spawn, if you will, his faction, his alumni, so to speak, they're now all over the place. So just who are these alumni? Who are we talking about? Let's just go through a list with some commentaries about various of these British media executives so you can get an idea. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to get to all of them in this show, but let's start. First, they're generally going to be from Fleet Street. Fleet Street is sort of the printing square of the London tabloid right, the Lord Thompson of the Fleet, to use an expression. Those were the Thompson newspapers. They were owned by a guy named Thompson. There was Lord Fiferbrook, or Featherbrook, who was in the Churchill cabinet, who was a minister during World War II. So this kind of stuff is clear, but the past master practitioner of this absolutely is Rupert Murdoch. And so often when we go through this list, you're going to find people that are alumni of his. So in the past couple of weeks, we had this strange incident where there was this new boss of the Washington Post, and the new publisher, the old publisher, retired and went his way, but the new publisher of the Washington Post is this character named Will Lewis. Now, these people, they realize that they're not going to be popular, so they camouflage themselves. So if you look at the masthead, go ahead, look at the masthead sometime, you will see that The guy's name is William Lewis. And I'm afraid I have to add that since 2021 or so, he became Sir William Lewis. He was knighted by, I guess it was back in the time of Boris Johnson. He was the guy who elevated William Lewis to the point of being a knight. So during the time that Boris Johnson was the prime minister, Lewis was made the publisher of the Washington Post. Now, there is an executive American woman, her name is Busby, Sally Busby, and she was kicked out as the publisher. And you could say it was more like she was driven out, she resigned or whatever it is. And when this happened, it was announced that the immediate replacement would be a guy called Murphy. And Murphy would stay around until the November election in the U.S. And after that, the post of executive editor boss of the main newsroom operation would be this guy Murphy. But then he would be replaced by another British veteran of this, which is a guy named Winnett. And Winnett is yet another veteran of this world of Fleet Street. So you have this guy named David Folkenflik, and he's a media correspondent of National Public Radio. And he has reported in past months, I guess, that he was interested in this question of the running of the Washington Post. And he went and he talked to Sir William Lewis. And in the course of this, Folkenflik noticed that there was a scandal continuing in London. And this is the cell phone hacking scandal in London, which generally people associate with the News of the World. Now, the News of the World, it's not the Tom Hanks movie. The News of the World was the most extreme London tabloid. The News of the World, like I said, there is a very popular movie recently with the same name. But this is the actual newspaper. Not in existence anymore, but for a while, it was, because of this telephone hacking scandal, for a while, it was the biggest English language newspaper in the world. It was like the New York Daily News of that era, for those of you who remember that. But they were tapping phones, and you had a situation where if you were a royal, they were tapping your phone, and if you were Tony Blair, they were tapping your phone. And Murdoch was a part of this, and his newspapers were literally tapping people's cell phones with what you could only call reckless abandon, I think. Like I said, you could be a member of the royal family, they would tap your cell phone. You could be the victim of a high-profile crime, they would tap your cell phone. And eventually, this exploded. The idea that there were systematic policies of phone tapping, it blew up in the public, and it meant that the editor of the News of the World was fired. And other people in the Murdoch hierarchy, because, he owned it, they were fired too. And eventually the News of the World was closed. They just shut it down and ceased to exist because, it was now a money loser. So who then emerges, surprise, surprise, within the Murdoch empire to pick up the pieces? It was Sir William Lewis. He was the guy who did whatever could be done to put a lid on this explosive scandal. And therefore, there was an attempt just in the past several months by, of all people, Prince Harry, the ex-Spectre Prince, who lives in California with Meghan Markle, I believe lives in Montecito. And Prince Harry wanted to expand his lawsuit to include Rupert Murdoch, saying that his tabloid journalists were tapping phones. And I guess, that would be Prince Harry's phones. But the judge said, no, you can't implicate Rupert Murdoch. That would be a bad thing. And Prince Harry said, all right, then, I can't sue. Can I sue William, this Sir William Lewis? And the judge said, no, can't sue him either. Then he says, can I mention Sir William in court papers? And then the judge said, yeah, sure. Go ahead, you can do that part. I mean, this is not necessarily the American way, but this is what happens in England. So Sir William Lewis is the one who is cleaning up all this News of the World mess. And Folkenflik is talking to him. And, Sir William Lewis says, I want you to stop writing articles about the cell phone tapping scandal. And if you stop it, I'll give you an exclusive interview. You alone get to know what my plans for the future of the Washington Post and for other important media properties. So what had happened with Sally Busby is that she had wanted to cover this precise affair some weeks ago, a month ago, whenever it was, saying, hey, Sir William, we want to tell you a news story, not a big deal, about what's going on in London, in that London civil case concerning the tapping of phones by the aggressive Fleet Street attack journalists of News of the World, going back, 10, 15 years easily. And so Sir William said, don't do it. She said, no, I'm going to have to do it anyway. And he said, this is a big failure of judgment. And within 3 weeks, boom, she was gone. An American, she was gone. So Lewis was hired by Bezos, and Bezos kind of wanted an enforcer because the Washington Post was losing money. But he's brought in some of these people. And for example, you have Emma Tucker. She's a British woman. She's carrying out the layoffs that I told about. She appeared recently. This is the weird thing about her. She appeared recently at a meeting in Davos, the World Economic Forum, and she gave a speech lately where she said that there was a time when newspapers like us owned the news. We owned reality. We were the gatekeepers. We were the gatekeepers to news and reality. So says Emma Tucker. And, this is not encouraging at all. And again, she's even carrying out layoffs in the framework of that. So what about CNN? We've talked here about the owner of CNN. It's the ultimate guy is this guy named Zaslav. But there's a specific day-to-day boss, and that would be, once again, an English person, Sir Mark Thompson. Isn't this interesting? The U.S. media is now in the hands of Sir William, Sir Mark, and Emma. She's obviously at some point going to become what is known as a dame of the British Empire, just like you have Anna Wintour of Vogue, Vogue magazine. She's Dame Anna Wintour. She tells you what it's like and what's beautiful and what's ugly, blah, blah, blah. So Dame Anna Wintour. So we've got Sir Mark, Sir William, Dame Anna, and that's the equivalent of Sir for the ladies. And we've got, of course, we don't want to forget A.G.Salzberger over at the New York Times, who's also pursuing his own vendetta and feud against Biden for going on Howard Stern instead of sitting down for a meeting with the New York Times. But it's this presumption, it's this arrogance, and we've talked about it before, that they should get that. It's their right to get that. Just like Emma talking about in the World Economic Forum, how we're the gatekeepers. This is their presumption. That's what they think. And, it's just stuff. It's the same old stuff against Biden. He's old. How about Trump? Does he have dementia? You don't hear a word about that. And so, it may change, but I don't know. So anyway, that's a little bit of, information about that. And I hope that's been of some interest for you. It's kind of a digression. It's kind of an aside, but, it is kind of a concern. And there's kind of a changing of the guard that's occurred. Rupert Murdoch is very much behind it. And it's something that, we need to be concerned about with regard to how we're getting our news and what the slant is on the news that we're getting. And this is Politics by Jake. All right. Well, once again, we're at the end of our time, and that's another show. I wanted to mention briefly, because I talk about judges quite a bit here, and I try to go over these things because the judges are actually very important. Lincoln spent some time talking about this, and what he said is really quite remarkable, which is one of the reasons why Lincoln is known as one of the founding fathers. And what he said is so radical that people have difficulty understanding it. I'm just going to quote it here for you. I've quoted it before, but it bears quoting again. He was talking about the Supreme Court, and he said, and once again, it's just amazing, the insight that he has on this. And you have to consider this. He said, the candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government on vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made in ordinary litigation between parties in personal actions. So in other words, taking something that's garden variety, very small, very routine, and applying it to the entire state proper. So ordinary litigation between parties in personal actions, the people, as a consequence, will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. And what he's saying here is that you're going to get yourself into a situation, if you allow this to happen, and if you allow the decisions of the Supreme Court to be looked upon this way, where they are going to control you, not the president, not the military, not the houses of Congress, but the judiciary. And this is a profound statement, and we all ought to consider it very carefully. And the judges have great power. You have this situation with Eileen Cannon, where she has overstepped even the judicial boundaries that her own judiciary have set, and they want to remove her from the documents case down in Fort Pierce because she has so egregiously violated judicial standards on this. And we'll have more to say about that. That's all for now. The next edition of Politics by Jake will be June 28th at 7 a.m., and we'll see you then. Have a great week. Bye-bye now.